Lanterns is an upcoming DCU HBO Max show that will feature both Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart in the lead roles, with the latter technically making his live-action debut. This show won't be released for a few years, but we do already have some details provided to us by James Gunn and Peter Safran that point to the premise and potentially the main villain of this show, but also the main villain of the entire chapter. So here's what we know about Lanterns. The show is described by the co-CEOs of DC Studios as a terrestrial-based mystery inspired by True Detective that leads into the overall story of Chapter 1, and in it, we'll discover an ancient horror on Earth. With that information at our disposal, I think we can reasonably theorize about what that means for who the main villain will be, because we know it must connect to something larger. I made individual videos for Superman Legacy and The Brave and the Bold before this, where I limited the main villain candidates to include only villains of the main characters who have either been hinted at or were featured heavily in the comic inspiration of these movies. Lanterns, however, is another story because literally only one Green Lantern villain has been hinted at, and there simply aren't enough viable candidates from the story inspiration. Because of that, for this video, I'll be including a character who has never been hinted at. He's a Green Lantern villain who I think would fit well with the story, as well as one more candidate who has been hinted at heavily, but is not a Green Lantern villain, because I think it's a possibility that this show will not be using a Green Lantern villain as its main villain, as much as that would be disappointing for me personally. Before we get to that, however, let's go over the first category of villain for this video, which are all the villains that are a part of the comic inspiration for this show, which not only from what I could tell isn't anywhere near as important for the adaptation as the previous two videos, especially compared to The Brave and the Bold, but also there are two of them. There is the visual representation in the announcement, which was Green Lantern Earth 1, which I think was only really used as the visual representation because the art looks cool, and it features both Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart, even though in that art, Jon Stewart is a Yellow Lantern. The story explores an alternate universe with a very unconventional Green Lantern Corps, and Jon Stewart is a member of the Yellow Lantern Corps. I like this story, but I would not use it as the basis for honestly anything aside from the inspiration for the visuals, because it's an alternate universe reinvention of the Corps, and the regular Green Lantern Corps, which yes, has been reinvented many times, but in the Prime universe, has never been done well in live action. That being said, I will use this story as an excuse to include a certain villain group because they fit well. The villains of Green Lantern Earth 1 are the Yellow Lantern Corps, who I'll get to later, an unnamed Guardian, who I will talk about briefly, but I'll barely consider, as well as the Manhunters, who were the precursors to the Green Lantern Corps in that they were a peacekeeping agency created by the Guardians billions of years ago. The Manhunters went rogue, however, massacring nearly all life in Space Sector 666, which also connects directly to the origin of Atrocitus, and by extension, the Red Lantern Corps, and technically also Black Hand and Blackest Night eventually. Now you might be thinking that this doesn't sound like it'd fit the Earth-based story, but on the contrary, the Manhunters have had a surprisingly grounded Earth-based presence in the DC universe, as in the past, they've infiltrated Earth disguised as humans and started cults dedicated to them, with a lot of the characters who are close to the main heroes in the DC universe being secret agents of the Manhunters, including Wally West's father and Lana Lang. Paradoxically, despite being from arguably the most cosmic side of the DC universe, the Manhunters were very Earth-based for some reason, and over the years, a couple different street-level powerless heroes who could potentially appear in Lanterns, like Mark Shaw and Kate Spencer, went by the name Manhunter, which by the way has nothing to do with the Martian Manhunter at all. One of those two Manhunters, Mark Shaw, was more recently revealed as the Leviathan, leader of the villainous Leviathan organization from the comic Event Leviathan. This comic, which came out just a couple of years ago, was a conspiracy thriller which is all about discovering who Leviathan is. A mystery-based story like that would work really well as the basis for this mystery-based show. The Manhunters are Green Lantern villains, and they could also fit the quote where Gunn said that we'll be meeting an ancient horror on Earth, as he never said the ancient horror originates on Earth, and the Manhunters have a very, very strong presence on Earth in the comics. The only thing I'm struggling with here is how I would fit the Manhunters with the big story of the chapter and how it could connect to the big bad. I did mention the eventual connection to Blackest Night, which is a potential story for what the chapter leads into, only because it could work, not because it's been hinted at, because honestly it hasn't been. But even then, the connection between the Manhunters and Blackest Night is like a couple degrees off, it's tangential at best, and there's another Earth-based villain who fits that particular criteria way better, who I'll get to later on. As for the likelihood, I think the Manhunters are highly likely, as they would fit a lot of boxes. However, Mark Shaw specifically is much less so, even if it would be an interesting path they can take. He's just not really a Green Lantern villain, and to be honest, as Leviathan, his villainous role, he doesn't really have much a connection to the Manhunters, and when he went by Manhunter, he was more of a good guy, so honestly, I don't think I should even consider him for this video, since he wasn't in that story, he isn't a Green Lantern villain, and he doesn't really have much connection to the Manhunters when he is a villain. So yeah, I'm disqualifying Mark Shaw from this video, even though he kind of would fit. Which leaves just the Manhunters, so I guess the candidate here is that the Manhunters would be like the villainous organization or the cannon fodder they have to fight. Meanwhile, their leader, who in the comics has been a couple characters, but the only one who would work is the Manhunter High Master, because the others are like Hank Henshaw and the Anti-Monitor. So the Manhunter High Master, who's really just a Manhunter, but I guess stronger and in charge, that's the first candidate for who the main villain will be, and honestly, it's relatively likely. Then there's the unnamed Guardian from the story, who will absolutely not be the villain of this show, especially since he doesn't have a name, so even if they do use a Guardian as the villain, he won't necessarily be the same character. They'll probably give him a name. Then there are the Sinestro Corps, who are actually also present in the other comic inspiration of this show, which might sound like it gives it more validity, but honestly, they're not likely at all. On DC.com, there's a list of 8 comics. Each comic represents one of the announced DCU projects, with all of the comics that Gunn said is inspiring some of these movies and shows being used. We can assume Gunn had input into this list and put the comics that are the main inspirations for these projects. For some reason, Superman Legacy and Paradise Lost do not have representations in the form of comics on this list. However, Lanterns does, and the comic is Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps. It's unclear if this means just the first story, as that is the thumbnail of the comic, or the entire volume, since this does link to all 51 issues. This is one of the stories that Gunn hasn't really talked about at all in terms of the comic inspiration, so this is really all we have to go off of aside from the visual representation. But 51 issues is a lot. It has many different stories, many different villains, so to simplify things, I'll assume only the first story is inspiration, although I don't think it'll have very much impact on the story either way, or even the villain, since this story is not Earth-based at all. It's entirely cosmic. The story is called Sinestro's Law, and I think you could guess who the main villain is. Right out of the gate, I do not think Sinestro or the Sinestro Corps would fit here, and I think he's highly unlikely to be the villain. He just wouldn't fit the Earth-based story, nor would he fit as the ancient horror important for the chapter elements of the show, and on top of that, just based on the fact that this is a show, not a movie, I think we could all but eliminate the other Lantern Corps from contention, as alongside the Green Lanterns themselves, it would simply be too expensive to pull off on a TV budget, even if it's like the most expensive TV show of all time, which is why I've been saying they really should have made this into a film franchise, not a TV show. Parallax is also one of the main villains of this story, but it was used as the main villain of the 2011 flop, which is Green Lantern, and everything I said about Sinestro and his Corps is true for him as well, so he's absolutely not being considered to be the main villain of this show, and he's the least likely villain in this entire video, just because he's like the only Green Lantern villain ever, aside from Hector Hammond, to be used in a movie. Category number 2 are villains who have been hinted at by James Gunn, and there is really just one, that being Dexstar, and he is a cat. For those of you who don't know, because maybe you haven't played Injustice 2, Dexstar, originally named Dexter, is just a regular cat from Earth with a very sad backstory, who then becomes a member of the Red Lantern Corps and partner to Atrocitus. This hint therefore extends to those associated characters and or groups whom Dexstar can't really exist independently of, but frankly, that doesn't really matter. All the things I said about the Sinestro Corps apply to the Red Lantern Corps as well, even more so. They'd be too expensive, they wouldn't fit the Earth-based ancient mystery that the show will focus on. On top of that, I mean, surely they'd use the Sinestro Corps before using the Red Lantern Corps, and the hint is actually pretty weak. James Gunn likes celebrating Catter Day every Saturday, and he liked a few pictures on Twitter of cats from the DC Universe. Most of these images were of Dexter, but at the same time, it was 3 images, and 2 of the 3 were of Dexter, and even then, it's only because he's arguably the most interesting cat in the DC Universe, and not a hint towards the potential use of him and his core and Atrocitus on Lanterns. I did want to include them because they're literally the only Green Lantern villain to be hinted at by James Gunn, and also they would look good on the thumbnail, but they are absolutely not going to be the main villains of this show. That brings us to the final category of the video, which is really like a mix of 1, a Green Lantern villain who's never been hinted at but would fit really well, and then a villain who has been hinted at a lot but is not a Green Lantern villain. And the first candidate is somebody I have mentioned before in this video, but also in previous videos on a similar topic, Black Hand. William Hand, aka Black Hand, was originally just a typical supervillain and enemy of Hal Jordan, but later on he became a lot more interesting. He is a sadistic, death-obsessed serial killer who, during Hal Jordan's initial training in a retelling of his origin, is sought after by Atrocitus, from whom he gets his high-tech alien weapon, with which he's able to kill a lot of people. The reason Atrocitus seeks him out is that he's a prophet who knows about the prophecy of the Blackest Night and wants to bring about the destruction of the Guardians due to the Manhunters massacre of his sector that I mentioned earlier, and he sees in one of his prophecies that Black Hand is a vital part of the Blackest Night prophecy. Described by Atrocitus as the quote-unquote doorway to darkness, Black Hand later becomes the herald of Nekron and leader of the Black Lantern Corps, and this whole thing fits perfectly with what we know about this show, on one condition. As a human, he fits the Earth-based story. As a serial killer, he fits the detective thriller premise, and one of his murders can jumpstart the Lantern's investigations. As the future herald of Nekron and the leader of the Black Lantern Corps, he and Nekron can fit the show, as maybe Nekron is the ancient horror that's being described. He could either be from Earth in this universe, or, like I said earlier, they never specified that the ancient horror has to come from Earth, just that he's on Earth, and then the show would be vital to the story of the chapter, which could all potentially lead up to a Blackest Night event movie or 2-parter, with Black Hand, the Black Lantern Corps, and specifically Nekron as the main villains and big bads of this chapter. As for the likelihood, I do think a Blackest Night movie would be awesome, but maybe using the story as the climax of the chapter will be a bit too Green Lantern specific, and also it may not work in a world that isn't full of dead superheroes like the comic book world was at the time. It does kind of fit the title of the chapter though, with the Lantern entities arguably being gods, and the Black Lantern zombies certainly being monsters. But I don't know how likely it is for Nekron to be the big bad. So honestly, Black Hand is the most likely villain in this video, but that is only if it's all leading up to Blackest Night, which in and of itself isn't that likely. So while Black Hand could still work as the main villain, right now he's not the most likely in this video. That goes to the next candidate. The final candidate is a bunch of dinosaurs, and I'm only half kidding. A lot of evidence has come out since the Slate announcement in the last month or so that points towards the story DC The New Frontier having some sort of influence on either the Justice League movie or potentially even the entire chapter, which I went in depth in the previous video I posted on this channel. There's the fact that just like the DCU, The New Frontier is made up of chapters, and Chapter 4 shares its name with the first chapter of the DCU, Gods and Monsters. Also, Gunn reposted an Instagram post right after the announcement, specifically about DC The New Frontier, and most recently, a scooper who gets many things right teased this story. The reason this all matters is that the villain of The New Frontier, the Center, who's also known as Dinosaur Island, fits the description of this show better than any other villain potentially in the entirety of the DC universe. As an island-sized being who was around alongside the dinosaurs millions and millions of years ago, and in fact saved some of them but now wants to destroy humanity, and he does this by using those dinosaurs, but also influencing the emotions and also the religions of humanity, the center does fit the description of an ancient horror on Earth. I know I've been saying that they never specified that the horror has to come from Earth, however, I think it's more likely if it does, and the center, he does. Then, with a bit more influence from the story, it could definitely fit the mystery-based detective story they're going for. In this story, DC The New Frontier, Batman investigates and then fights a murderous cult who worship the center, and it's very possible that Lanterns will take that story and give it to themselves. Now, that would mean that the center would be the big bad of this chapter, but unless the Lanterns get their ass kicked at the end, it wouldn't make sense for the center to be the main villain of this show. Instead, it would be the leader of the center's cult who would be the main villain of this show, and that could be, honestly, anyone. The only villain with any connection to the center in the comics is Vandal Savage, and Vandal Savage did originate as an enemy of the Alan Scott version of Green Lantern, but the connection between Savage and the center is very weak. It's just that he went to the center one time, and he's one of the few beings to survive that encounter, and using Vandal Savage as the main villain of a Green Lantern show as the leader of a cult that worships the center would be a misuse of Vandal Savage, who has the potential to be one of the best villains in the DC universe. This possibility, sans Vandal Savage, is actually relatively likely, as the Lanterns investigating the cult of the center has more evidence backing it than any other possibility on this list. The problem is that unless we include Vandal Savage, who I don't think has enough connection, this isn't really a candidate for who the main villain will be, and more so what the story of the season will be instead, or maybe you could say it's a candidate for who the villainous organization is, but not its leader. The leader of the cult of the center could be many different characters though, and I hope if they do go down this route that they change one of the Earth-based Lantern villains into a cult leader, like maybe Dr. Polaris, Evil Star, or I guess Hector Hammond is a possibility, but he's been used before, just so that the main villain of a Green Lantern show is a Green Lantern villain, and even if he's very different from the comics, which is fine by me with these specific characters. I will say this story kinda sounds a bit boring and far too steeped in the New Frontier comic, and not even the Green Lantern side of that comic for what I'd expect or hope from a Green Lantern show. I'd much prefer Black Hand or the Manhunters, but I think this is more likely. So, with all the candidates out of the way, here is every one of these villains ranked by how likely I think they are to be the villain, based on all the facts and speculation I just presented, and I decided to not even consider Vandal Savage since his connection to the center is far too weak. The least likely is Parallax. He was used before in a franchise-ruining movie, and he wouldn't fit the terrestrial-based detective story at all. Then there's the unnamed Guardian, who wouldn't fit the story, and just the fact that he isn't given a name makes it so I doubt that part of the story will be any influence on the show. The Red Lantern Corps were only hinted with a very weak hint. They wouldn't fit the terrestrial-based detective story, they might be too expensive for the show, and would certainly not be used before the Sinestro Corps, unless if this story does have Black Hand as the main villain, in which case Atrocitus could be like a side villain for this show. And then there's Sinestro and his Corps, which wouldn't fit the terrestrial-based detective story, and it might be too expensive for the show. The center would fit the story and is heavily hinted at, but he's hinted at to be the big bad of the chapter, not the villain of this season. Although it's still possible, he definitely fits the Agent Horror on Earth better than anyone. I think he's going to be built up to and hinted at in this season, not shown, and definitely not the main villain. And then there's the Manhunters, who would fit the story and details we know, and are important parts of the Green Lantern mythos, and are an Ancient Horror. They're not from Earth, but they have a large presence on Earth. And then there's Black Hand, who's the second most likely, but would be easily the most likely if it's all leading up to Blackest Night. And finally is the Cult of the Center and whoever their leader would be, which would fit the story and is heavily hinted at through hints towards the New Frontier. And while the Center is more likely to be the big bad, the Cult of the Center might just be the villains of this season. And in fact, based on the evidence we've seen up until this point, I believe they're the most likely, although it's certainly Black Hand who I would like to see the most. So, there you have it. My prediction is that Lanterns will revolve around Hal and John investigating and then going up against the Cult of the Center. I don't have a prediction for who the leader will be, aside from maybe a Green Lantern villain from Earth who's reworked into a cult leader like maybe Dr. Polaris or Evil Star. For now though, I guess the video is a bit incomplete, but maybe later down the line we'll make an updated version when we get more information. For now though, thanks for watching and goodbye.